Yes.
If I can just pick up one area of questioning from before the break, I'd asked you about the payments made by the Department of Health and Social Care in respect of HIV to the Scottish Government. And I've been asked to clarify one matter with you. In relation to those who are co-infected, does the hepatitis C element of what they receive also get paid from the Department of Health and Social Care?
No, that's paid by the Scottish Government.
Thank you. Now, I want to ask you next about two omissions from the current scheme. The first is in relation to hepatitis B. So SIBS includes HIV and hepatitis C, as the Alliance House organisations do, but no one who is infected with hepatitis B in consequence of infected blood products or blood is eligible to receive a payment from SIBS. Why is that? Ms. Gougeon?
You want me to answer?
Ms. Baker, yes, certainly.
Well, as you say, the previous schemes just looked at hepatitis C and HIV. As far as I understand it, the reason that a scheme in relation to hepatitis B has never been taken forward is because the blood services were always screening blood donations for hepatitis B going way back, so that is why we don't include hepatitis B in the scheme.
And during the time that you've been in post, Ms. Baker, so since 2016, has the Scottish Government ever given specific consideration to the position of those infected with hepatitis B and whether they should receive some form of financial support?
Not specifically, no. Obviously, I'm aware that this inquiry is looking at it, so clearly we would want to take account of the inquiry's views, but it's not something we've looked at.
Okay. Ms. Gougeon, is there anything you can add from a ministerial perspective that might address the concerns of those infected with hepatitis B?
Well, I would say that it's just not been an area that's been raised with me in relation to this. But again, if that's an area of concern that the inquiry believes that the Scottish Government should consider, then we would absolutely look to consider that.
The second gap or omission in the scheme I want to ask you about is the position of the bereaved family members beyond partners, widows, or dependent children under the age of 21 in full-time education. Now, there are many bereaved who are not eligible to receive money from SIBS, including in particular parents whose children died or adult children whose parents died. Why have they not been included in the Scottish scheme? Ms. Baker?
Well, as I understand it, we have discussed it. I know it has been raised, and I know that the Minister has discussed it with Haemophilia Scotland and SIBF, so she may want to add more. But when we've looked at this in the past, you'll be aware that our scheme derives in relation to hepatitis C from Section 28 of the Smoking Health and Social Care Scotland Act 2005, which talks about being able to make payments to dependents. We've been advised that while Scottish ministers have some discretion in relation to how you define a dependent, that really we would need to be looking at people who in some way were either financially dependent or dependent for care on the infected person. So our advice has been that currently the legislation doesn't allow for us to make payments under the scheme to broader categories, if you like, people you've described.
Ms. Gougeon.
Yes, I would agree with what Sam has said, and that's certainly the advice that I received. that would go beyond the definition of dependent as it's laid out in the legislation at the moment.
If we leave aside any constraints imposed by the current legislation, because legislation obviously is something that can in principle be amended, what about the moral responsibility or moral case for including within the scheme people who have suffered some of the greatest tragedies imaginable, the loss of a parent or loss of a child? Ms Gougeon, is that something that the Scottish Government is willing to consider further?
Well, it's something that I've been happy to look at during the time that I've been in post and have wanted to consider further, because just because somebody doesn't necessarily fall within that legal definition or as it's laid out as being dependent, that doesn't account for the impact that it may have had on other people's lives. And like you've said there, that, you know, adult children or people who've had to care for someone who's been affected by this. So I think it's something that warrants further consideration.
And would it be right to understand from the answers you've given that, as a matter of fact, the Scottish Government hasn't up till now undertaken any assessment or study of the losses sustained by children or parents who might fall within that category?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Can I then come to the question of parity and the discussions that have taken place over the last year or so and where they have got to? But before we do that, it might assist to get a sense of the extent of disparity. And I'm going to do so by looking at a table that I think was prepared by the Haemophilia Society. Seamus, it's RLIT 40643, please. Now, I'm not going to be asking you about the detail of the figures that are within this, but it's really just to provide some context for the questions that follow. We can see here, if we just zoom in a little, please, Seamus, we can see here that the Haemophilia Society has put together some comparison figures for the four nations, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And we can see that there are, for example, if we look at the second item, the hepatitis C stage 1 one-off lump sum, there's significant differences in terms of what was available in Scotland as opposed to England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And then hepatitis C stage 1 moderately affected. There we see larger regular payments in England and Northern Towards smaller in Scotland and Wales. If we just zoom out again, if we look down towards the bottom of the table, we can see in relation to bereaved partners, the provision made in the other nations for a £10,000 one-off lump sum, and then the provision made in Scotland, which did not include that lump sum, but was the 100% of payments for 12 months and then 75% of that amount. So there are obviously other disparities, and the figures have changed in various respects over the years. But we can see that there have been, since the schemes were set up in 2017, fairly significant differences between the types of payment and the amounts of payment made between the four nations. So would it be fair to say that the disparity between the schemes is something that's been an obvious fact from their inception, Ms Baker?
Yes, I think so. It's we've talked about the financial review, so it's clear that was recommending things that were different from what, for example, the English scheme was looking at back in 2016, when I think they did a consultation and looked at some changes which went in a slightly different direction. So certainly the payment levels have evolved since there, and that has perhaps increased some of the differences between them.
And then if we look at just a couple of documents before I ask you some questions. Ms Gougeon, your witness statement, if we go to WITN 5672001, and we go to page 7, paragraph 6.5, top of the page, Ms Gougeon, you say this in response to a question about the differences between the schemes. You say the Scottish Government recognises that it can be frustrating for beneficiaries in each scheme where they see that another scheme is providing more generous payment levels. That applies equally within the UK as it does when beneficiaries compare support with that provided in other countries outside the UK. While the Scottish Government believes it's beneficial to have some consistency in the support between the 4 nations, we believe any changes to SIBs should be based on evidence of need and not simply to match what other UK nations are doing. Where there is good practice identified in other schemes, we would seek to adopt that where possible. So if we just that was your statement, Ms Gougeon. And then if we could look at WITN 4508001, please. This is a statement from Sally Richards. If we go to the 3rd page, please. So I should say she's the scheme manager of SIBS. And if we look at the top half of the page, we just scroll down a tiny bit further, please, Shomik. Thank you. So we can see under paragraph B, she refers to the legislative origin of the scheme, and then says this: the Scottish Government sets the policies and level of payments for SIBs based on Scottish circumstances. These are therefore not influenced by levels of payment in other devolved administrations. The Scottish Government does ensure it's aware of payment levels and policies within other parts of the UK, but given this is a devolved matter, the Scottish Government does not feel it's necessary or appropriate to monitor the consistency of policy and awards across the devolved administrations. And looking at both what Ms Richards says and what Ms Gougeon's witness statement says, would it be fair to say that the issue of parity has not been regarded by the Scottish Government as a particularly pressing issue previously, in part because the Scottish Government's scheme, based upon the Financial Review Group report, made some higher and different payments from the other schemes? Is that a fair comment, Ms Baker?
Yes, I think so. The position on parity has certainly evolved, but yeah, I think the principle's still the same that we, Ms Gougeon may want to add, but the Scottish Government has wanted to maintain some flexibility, but at the same time to try and increase parity between the schemes as much as possible.
Yeah, and I would say that I can completely understand it from someone who, from the perspective of people who are beneficiaries of the scheme and to see big differences in other schemes across the UK. I do think it's really important in Scotland that we retain a Scottish scheme that's flexible to the needs of people here and that it can respond quite quickly to that if there were any changes that needed to be made. And I think maintaining that is quite important, but I think particularly from a beneficiary's perspective, that could be frustrating to see, particularly in the areas where there are quite stark contrasts in the differences in payments.
Well, we can take that down. Thank you, Shomik. Ms Gougeon, your statement refers to there having been discussions with the other nations looking to try and increase parity of sport between the 4 schemes. I'm going to ask Ms Baker in a moment to tell us a little more about the history of that. But in terms of your own involvement since December 2020, what discussions are you aware of that have taken place between the 4 nations?
Well, certainly in my role, I haven't been directly involved in discussions personally. I was aware that discussions around parity had been ongoing for some time, but it was only in March that things really seemed to progress. I think I became aware the day before there are weekly 4 nations meetings with it was the Cabinet Secretary for Health, as well as the other health secretaries from the other 4 nations. Those occur weekly, and I think the day before the meeting on the 11th of March, we were made aware that it was going to be an issue on the agenda at that point, and then it was discussed at the meeting on the 11th of March, where I think all ministers agreed that parity should be pursued. But then I don't think there was much over the course of the next couple of weeks until about the 24th of March, So while a decision had been reached at that meeting that we'd work towards parity, we didn't know exactly when that would be until there was a bit of a flurry in terms of the decision making that needed to be made and needed to happen really quickly over the space of the 23rd, 24th and 25th of March.
And the decision making that needed to be made by whom? Was it effectively a question of needing something from the UK government? Or was there internal decision-making within the Scottish Government that was outstanding?
Yes, like I say, Sam Baker will be able to give more information perhaps on the background and what had led up to this, but I think that, discussions about parity had been ongoing for some time, because I believe that they were, within the UK government, they were trying to get agreement from Treasury as to the funding for trying to reach that parity across the four nations. So I think it was really from that perspective, we were asked to give costs. I think that may have been a couple of years ago, maybe that was 2019, 2020. We were then asked to give an updated cost after that meeting that was held on the 11th of March as to what parity was expected to cost us. And again, as I say, then the decision making happened fairly rapidly after that point.
But what, if any, decisions fell to be taken by the Scottish Government in March of this year?
Really to agree to the proposals that had been put forward. So we required the funding to enable that to happen, and those were the decisions that needed to be made. So
is it right to understand that the Scottish Government was waiting for confirmation from the Westminster Government that additional funding would in principle be made available?
Yes.
Ms. Baker, I'm going to then take you back and ask you a little about the discussions over a longer period of time, and to do so by reference to a handful of documents. Could we have, Shomik, RLIT 301491, please? And we see bottom of the page. This is an answer by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, I think, or answer, sorry, by the Department of Health and Social Care, 14th of June 2019. It refers to a major uplift announced on the 30th of April to financial support available in the English scheme. And then it says this: as announced at that time, the government is committed to working with its counterparts in the devolved administrations to look at the issue of parity of support across the United Kingdom. I have written to my counterparts in all the other devolved nations, including the Permanent Secretary of Northern Ireland, inviting them to meet to discuss this issue at the earliest opportunity. A date for this meeting is currently being sought. Ms. Baker, there were, as I understand it, regular meetings between representatives of the four nations prior to this, looking at issues such as the workings of the individual schemes. This might suggest that until this point in time, parity had not been a particularly prominent part of those discussions or meetings. Is that right?
I think so. Certainly we had discussed it before then. I can't remember exactly when we started discussing it, but I know, I think it was following the inquiry actually raising it. I can't remember exactly when that happened, but certainly had been discussions at official level about it, but they hadn't progressed very far. And then as the PQ answer notes, that then the UK government made an announcement on 30th of April 2019. And following that, I think Department of Health ministers did try to progress it a bit more.
If we can just chart through a couple of further documents to see what, if any, progress was made. So that's June 2019. If we go then to SIBS 5011, please, Shomik. we can see this is a meeting in May 2020, the quarterly review with the Scottish Government. And as I understand it, this is a meeting between your team, Ms Baker, and we can see you're present at this meeting, and senior SIBS officials. Is that right?
Yes.
And these take place, as we would see from this, on a quarterly basis?
Yes.
And then if we just go a little further down the page, we can see it says SG update. So this is just below the bold discussion about the budget. Parity issues still under discussion. Information supplied to Penny Mordaunt, Minister now overseeing inquiry. However, no extra funding available. So we're pretty much a year on here from that Department of Health and Social Care announcement from June 2019. It doesn't appear that an enormous amount of progress had been made in that year. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, it's maybe sort of very brief summary of what was said, but certainly my impression was that there was the UK government hadn't been able to secure any additional funding, so that there was a lack of progress as a result of that, and things weren't progressing as quickly as we'd expected. I think when the Four Nations ministers had met back in July 2019, there had been a commitment to try and move forward fairly quickly, but I think that had not progressed as quickly as had been expected for a number of reasons. I think there was a change in ministers within the Department of Health, and then obviously with coronavirus, I think that caused further delays as well. So certainly we were hoping to move forward more quickly, but there didn't seem to be much in the way of updates from the UK government about progress.
And so where this says, however, no extra funding available, that's no extra funding available from the UK government? Yes,
that was probably just based on my understanding, but certainly that was what we understood at the time, that there wasn't any funding at that point. I understood that the UK government was still looking at it, but they hadn't been able to secure any funding at that point, as far as I was aware.
And then if we look at EIBS 40704, this is a letter from the Health Protection Division dated the 4th of August 2020 to the Department of Health and Social Care, headed Scottish Infected Blood Support Scheme, increasing parity between the four nations. And we can see the purpose is to provide a breakdown of funding required to reach parity of payments between SIBS and the schemes of the other nations. Paragraph 2 then refers to, it says, I'll read the whole thing. While the Scottish Government's preference would be to consider in more detail the evidence base for appropriate payment levels for each group of beneficiary based on the likely day-to-day impacts on them, in light of the in-principle agreement that no one's payment should decrease in reaching payment parity across the four nation schemes, additional funding is sought based on meeting the highest payment level in the UK for each beneficiary group. But before we just look at the rest of the letter, can you assist us, Ms Baker, with what's said to be there the Scottish Government's preference?
Yeah, I guess, well, originally when talk about parity was first mooted, I think our understanding or our expectation was that the four nations would get together and discuss and look at and possibly even consult on what should be the appropriate parity arrangement. I think the UK government's announcement that has just been referred to in April 2019 kind of sidetracked it a bit because they significantly increased the payments, so that I think then meant effectively, as you'll see has happened, that to achieve parity, the only realistic way to do that was to increase payments to the highest level for each category, because clearly we and the other schemes wanted to decrease anybody's payments. So I think there was a clear commitment that nobody should lose out as a result. So that meant that effectively we would need to increase payments to the English levels.
And so what we see then set out or referred to in the rest of the letter, and then I think there's an attachment which we don't have, but I don't think that matters for present purposes, is the Scottish Government's estimate of increasing the payments to meet the highest payment levels across the UK. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And if we go over the page, we can see paragraph 8 gives an estimated 5-year cost of changing payments as described to total 32.3 million. Now, this is August 2020. Are you able to assist us with this? When was the Scottish Government first asked to provide this breakdown of funding?
I think probably around June-ish, or June or July. Certainly, I think we provided initial figures by around the end of July 2020, and then maybe updated this covering information to provide a bit more detail, as it says on the 4th of August. So, but yeah, I think it was maybe, I don't remember exactly, it was about a month or so before this second one.
And so would you be right to understand that the Scottish Government hadn't been asked by the UK Government, as far as you're aware, prior to mid-2020 to provide this data?
Yeah, that's correct. We'd never been asked for that before.
And then if we just, following the developments through chronologically, if we go to EIBS 40705, we can see this is a letter from Penny Mordaunt, Paymaster General, to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, 21st of September 2020. And she says, I'm writing to update on the inquiry, as promised in my letter of the 13th of July, specifically our commitments on financial support and compensation. And then under the heading financial support, she refers to people receiving ex gratia financial and non-financial support. And the ministers and the previous Prime Minister have committed to address disparities across the UK in the levels of financial support provided. She then refers to figures, and we can see the £32 million there for Scotland, and then the figures for the other 3 nations. Reference is made to the Chair's observation about the grinding hardship experienced. And then there's a request, grateful for your views on how this additional funding would be integrated best into the 2020 Comprehensive Spending Review. And then if we look at the bottom of the page, under the heading Compensation for Victims, she says she expects the inquiry to make recommendations. Inevitable, the government will need to provide substantial compensation. The costs are likely to be high. I firmly believe we should begin preparing for this now, before the inquiry reports. And then over the page, she requests a meeting and then says, I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation, and then refers to having copied the letter to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Health. Ms Baker, was the Scottish Government aware of this request being made to the Treasury?
Yes, I think so. I don't believe we saw that letter, but we were certainly aware from the Cabinet Office that the Paymaster General had approached the Treasury.
And do you know how and when the Treasury responded?
I don't know, I'm afraid. You'd need to ask the Cabinet Office about that.
And then just looking at that penultimate sentence of the letter, I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation. Ms Gougeon, does the Scottish Government, or do you, I should say, in your capacity as Minister, agree with what's said there, that it's urgent to take action on financial support and compensation and that this is long overdue?
Yes.
Now, just then moving forward then to the end of 2020, if we go to WITN 4728035, please. And if we go to, I think it's the 3rd page of this, Shomick. Yes. So I should have said this is a meeting of the SIBS Advisory Group, 10th of December 2020. And if we look under the heading Scottish Government Update, we can see it's being reported, it's the second bullet point, parity discussions, Scottish Government hoping to have something in place ASAP, no update with regards to the Four Nations meetings other than that they continue to take place every 4 weeks. So would it be right to understand from this that by December 2020, there had been no further development following the submission of the Scottish estimates for funding?
Yes, I think that's correct. I don't think there was any signs to us that there was any significant progress by that time.
And then can you just assist us more generally? The Four Nations meetings referred to, are they ministerial meetings or civil servant meetings?
Civil servant meetings.
And then,
I think, sorry, there was discussion about having, as I mentioned, there was a meeting in July 2019, and there'd been an agreement to have a further ministerial meeting, and we did ask a number of times, and some of the other devolved administrations asked when that ministerial meeting would be able to take place, but so there was an intention to have it, but it never really happened, apart from the meeting that the minister's already mentioned.
And yeah, sorry, I just wanted to clarify on that point as well. I mean, I refer to a Four Nations meeting on the 11th of March, and that's obviously separate to the Four Nations meetings, the 4 weekly ones that have been held by officials, because there was the weekly Four Nations meetings, which all the Cabinet Secretaries and, well, relevant health secretaries attended.
okay, thank you. And then we'll look at the March 2021 announcement in a moment, but are either of you able to assist us in understanding why it's taken until March 2021, not long indeed before these hearings, for an announcement to be made that would enable broad parity between the schemes? Ms. Gougeon, first of all, what, if any, perspective do you have to offer on that?
In relation to the time that it's taken?
Yes.
To get here, I can only presume, based on the evidence I've seen and the letters that you've provided as part of the evidence as well, that it was about securing that funding from Treasury. And then I think it was a case of things progressing rapidly, because in both Wales and in Scotland, we were entering the pre-election period on the 25th of March. So it was important to get a decision and to have it announced by that time, if there was agreement on that, so that it wouldn't be delayed any further.
Ms. Baker, you've obviously been involved for a longer period of time than the Minister. What's your understanding of why it's taken this long to reach an announcement on achieving broad parity?
Well, similar to what the Minister said, I think, well, my understanding, again, is probably better to ask somebody from the UK government about this, but I think it was about trying to find funding, and it took some time for them to be able to identify a source of funding.
And then if we, as I say, I'll come on to the wording of the announcement in a moment, but before we do that, if we can just look at the advisory group meeting that post-dated the announcement, WITN 4728036, please, Shomek. So we can see this is the SIBS advisory group meeting on the 8th of April 2021. If we go to the second page, please. Bottom half of the page under the heading Scottish Government Update, we see you, Ms. Baker, reporting under the heading Parity Payments. You reference to the announcement of the 25th of March, agreement it will be backdated to 2019, and then saying this, currently awaiting monetary amount from UK government so that payments can go ahead as soon as possible, and then new scheme document will be formally agreed, and so on. What was it you were still waiting for on the 8th of April, and do you now have what you need?
We were waiting for a letter from the Department of Health and Social Care to confirm the amount that we would receive and when we would receive it, and sort of any terms associated with it. We haven't yet received that, although I understand that they are working on it. They have assured us that they're working to get something to us in writing to confirm the payments.
Okay. So is this right? The Scottish Government does not yet know how much it's going to receive, or over what period of time?
Yes, well, I think certainly the understanding we've been given is that we would receive the amount based on the figures we submitted, but we don't have anything in writing to confirm that. I think, yeah, our understanding is that that's what we will receive, but clearly we would like something in writing that would confirm that.
If we then just go to the wording of the March 2021 announcement, Seamus, it's RLIT 301498. And I'm going to look first of all at the Paymaster General statement and then at the Scottish Government statement. So we can see here, this is a statement by the Paymaster General, a written statement, I think. Today I'm providing an update on parity of financial support, the commitment to considering a compensation framework and enhancements to the psychological support for the victims of the infected blood tragedy. Under the heading parity, she refers to a UK-wide agreement in July 2019 in principle to resolve disparities in treatment, and then a reference to a meeting in January 2020 that the UK government held with campaigners. Then confirms that the following changes are planned to the 4 separate schemes to bring them into broader parity. Increases in annual payments will be backdated to April 2019, etc. And then if we skip over the changes to the English scheme, because those are for others to answer questions about, we go to a little further down, we can see the paragraph, in Scotland, the changes are to increase annual payments for infected beneficiaries and bereaved partners, and to introduce a £10,000 lump sum bereavement payments for the families of those beneficiaries who've died since the scheme began. And then again, Wales and Northern Ireland we'll come on to in the course of the week. If we go over the page, top of the page, she says, we've agreed with health ministers that any future changes to national schemes would be subject to consultation between the UK government and devolved administrations. And then under the heading compensation framework, to meet the government's commitment to consider a framework for compensation, we can confirm our intention to appoint an independent reviewer to carry out a study looking at options for a framework for compensation and to report back to the Paymaster General with recommendations before the inquiry reports. The terms of reference of this study will be finalised in consultation between the independent reviewer, those infected and affected. The study will include consideration of the scope and levels of such compensation and the relationship between a compensation framework and the existing financial support schemes. The study is entirely separate from the public inquiry, etc. And then, before I ask you a little more about this, if we can just look at the Scottish Government statement at SIBS 40129. Again, we can see this is dated the 25th of March 2021. If we go a little further down the page so we can see the text of the rest of the page, thank you. So we can see, it says, following comments about the disparities between infected blood payments across the UK by the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, agreement's been reached in principle between the 4 devolved governments to reduce these disparities. The Scottish Government is still waiting for confirmation of funding details from the UK Government, and as I understand it, Ms Baker, that's what you're still waiting for that?
Yes.
But
yes.
we currently expect that the following changes will be made to SIBS to bring annual payments into alignment across the UK, then if we go over the page, we can see the anticipated changes. So we can see an increase in payments for chronic hepatitis C stage 1, moderately affected and severely affected, a smaller increase for stage 2, for HIV, co-infected, sorry, the left-hand column is SIBS, the right-hand column UK parity. So we can see, in fact, that the increases are largely to achieve UK parity. And then if we go further down the page, we can see UK payment levels for the infected include a winter fuel allowance. SIBS will confirm in due course when this part of the payment will be paid. Is that still under consideration, Ms Baker, that particular matter?
Yes, I think we need to agree. I think we're talking about paying it in the autumn because that's what the English scheme does, but we haven't finally confirmed that.
Then
but I think that's the expectation.
Then we can see reference to the stage 1 group who self-assessed with no noticeable impact will be able to get an annual payment, and payments backdated to April 2019. And then there's a very bottom of the page. It's not entirely clear, but I think we can see it if we go to the top of the next page. In addition, those widows, widowers, civil partners or long-term cohabiting partners who have, and if we go to the top of the next page, we can see what it says, since remarried, entered into a new civil partnership or are living with a new partner will now be able to receive these regular annual payments as well. Will also receive backdated top-up payments for the period from April 2019. And then effective from April 2021, the new lump sum £10,000 payment on the death of a beneficiary. And reference then to an expectation in relation to HIV lump sum payments. So that's the Scottish Government's announcement. First of all, I think Ms Gougeon's already touched on this, I think, in her earlier answers, but how much involvement did the Scottish Government have in the UK Government's announcement on the 25th of March? Was that Ms Gougeon's earlier answer suggested it was something which came about very quickly. Is that right?
Yes, it did, and the turnaround for decision making was very tight as well. So it was really over the 23rd, 24th, and I think even up until the morning of the 25th, changes were still being made at that point, which was again difficult. I think when it came to all this, ideally we would have liked to have been in the position where we could have consulted with Haemophilia Scotland and with the Scottish Infected Blood Forum as well, and any changes that would be made, but we didn't have the time to do that before the pre-election period. So there were quite a lot of updates over that period over the course of those 3 days.
And then we've seen reference there to certain payments being backdated to April 2019. Why is the backdating to April 2019 rather than to the point at which the schemes diverged in April 2017?
Again, Sam will probably correct me if I'm wrong in this, but my understanding is that it's April 2019 because that's when the English scheme had increased their payments. So, yeah, Sam's nodding, so I presume that that's correct, and that's why that date was chosen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the UK government that proposed that was the date for backdating. But yes, I think that was the rationale.
Does the announcement, as reflected in what changes are going to be made by the Scottish Government, does that indicate that the failure to bring about a greater parity of payment between severely affected stage 1 and stage 2 was a mistake by the Scottish Government? Ms Baker?
I don't know if it was a mistake. I mean, I think obviously, and we reflected on earlier when we discussed the financial review group's report, there were differing views between different beneficiaries as to whether those in stage 1 and stage 2 should receive the same payment levels, and that was looked at in the clinical review. So I don't think it was a mistake, but I think as part of parity, we agreed that it was appropriate to move up to the English levels, and that obviously recognises the serious impacts on those in the severely affected group.
We saw at the bottom of the previous page, top of this page, that one change announced by the Scottish Government was that those who have subsequently remarried or entered into new long-term relationships will now be eligible to receive support payments. Previously, they were excluded from the scheme. Why has it taken again to March 2021 for that change to be made to the Scottish scheme. Ms. Gougeon?
I don't know why it had taken until that time for the change to be made, but I think that it's important that the change was made, and that was one that I'd agreed to.
Ms. Baker, are you able, with your longer term involvement in these issues, to assist in why that was a feature of the scheme in the first place, and why it's taken a number of years to be removed?
Yeah, my understanding is that this was part of the original financial review group discussions, that had been recognised that the payments, I mean, I think they were referred to as pension payments, although they're not actually a pension, would operate in a similar way to a pension. And so if you remarried, you wouldn't continue to receive that payment. So that's how it was set up. And you know, I should clarify that we did make discretionary payments to people who remarried. They weren't, so it was only the annual payments that they did not receive. But yes, certainly it has been raised a number of times by campaign groups, and I think as part of the parity arrangements, once we understood that some of the other schemes, particularly the Northern Irish scheme, had decided not to include any criteria that prevented people who remarried or had a new partner from claiming their widows' annual payments, or widowers and partners' annual payments. I think we felt that as part of the parity discussions, it was appropriate time to revisit that. So therefore, I asked the Minister for her views, and she agreed that it was appropriate to change the rules on that as part of the parity discussions.
In terms of the steps, so we can take that down, Shemek, in terms of the steps which will need to be taken to bring these changes into effect, first of all, what is your best estimate of when these changes will come into effect? Ms. Baker?
I think, well, as I've mentioned, we are still waiting for that letter from the Department for Health and Social Care, and I think our finance colleagues will be keen to receive that before SIB starts making payments, but I'm hopeful that will be received soon. So I'm afraid it's hard to say exactly when, and as the Minister's already alluded to, it's not yet clear if we would have a different minister, in which case they will need to sign off the few remaining details of the scheme, so that we can finalise an amending scheme document. But I think if we get that letter from the Department for Health and Social Care, I would hope to be able to start making the payments quite quickly. Certainly the increased annual payments for this year, as I understand it, are quite straightforward for SIBs to make. Some of the backdated and other payments may take a little bit longer, but yeah, we would be hopeful to pay them soon.
I'm sorry to press you on this, where in part you're waiting on information from others, in other words, the Department of Health and Social Care. But what does soon mean if you were, for example, to receive the Department of Health and Social Care letter within the next fortnight? What work is then required in broad terms, and how long would it take to start making at least some of the enhanced payments?
Well, assuming that the letter is as we expect and that doesn't create any issues or further uncertainty, then I think once, you know, future whoever is responsible as minister going forward is confirmed, then we would be able to do something quite quickly. We do need a new amending scheme document, which our lawyers are working on at the moment, but I don't think that should take too long. So if we get the letter soon and it's all okay, then I would think it would be possible to start making payments in June. But there are a few issues, and I think it was alluded to in that note of the advisory group that you showed a few minutes ago, that there's still one or two points that are being looked at, particularly around the the clinical review discussing whether the current three categories remain appropriate in light of the parity discussion, and therefore what that means for payment levels for the no noticeable impact group. So that does need to be agreed, but I'm hoping that can be agreed fairly soon. I understand the clinical review group is meeting later this week to discuss that.
And then going back to, I don't think we need to put it on the screen again, but if we just go back to the Paymaster General's 25th of March 2021 announcement, that indicated that future changes to the schemes would be the subject of consultation between the four nations. If we leave aside for a moment the compensation framework issue, which I'll come on to in a moment, first of all, is the Scottish Government, Ms Gougeon, committed to there being consultation and close working between the four nations for the future to try to ensure that disparities do not creep back into the system?
Yeah, I would expect that all four nations governments would be exactly the same. That's something that we've said we would do, that we would consult with each other over any changes. So I imagine that everybody would be committed to that and make sure that happens.
Now, just then asking you about, if I may, about the compensation framework, which we saw referred to in the Paymaster General's announcement. What, if any, involvement has the Scottish Government had in that aspect of the Paymaster General's involvement, Paymaster General's announcement? So the appointment of a reviewer to explore a compensation framework.
I personally haven't had any discussions with my counterparts in the UK government in relation to that, and only have the statement that was made there. So I don't know if there's been any discussions at official level regarding that.
Ms Baker?
No, there hasn't been any discussions about it. I think the Cabinet Office may have mentioned that they were looking at it, but they haven't involved us in any of the discussions about it.
Does the Scottish Government have any expectation of involvement or consultation about the appointment of the reviewer or the terms of reference or the work that's undertaken by the reviewer?
I don't, at the moment, I don't have expectations around that. Again, all I have is the statement that was laid out in that letter, but I would hope that we would at least be kept informed of how that progresses.
And having, as I understand it, essentially seen that announcement for the first time when it was made by the Paymaster General on the 25th of March, does the Scottish Government have any expectation as to who would fund any compensation framework?
Not at the moment, but yeah, it would really depend what comes out of that review, essentially.
Ms Baker, has anything been said at an official civil service level about whether the Scottish Government would be expected to contribute or whether this is money that would be expected to be forthcoming from Westminster?
Yeah, it's not something that's been discussed in any detail at all, so I'm afraid I don't know. As the Minister says, you know, we would be keen to be kept informed about what's discussed, but this is something that's been entirely led by the Cabinet Office, so we haven't been involved or been invited to input into it.
I'd like to move then to one final topic before I ask you a couple of last questions. The psychological support service. We've seen described in both of your statements the existing service providing psychological and psychiatric support to patients with bleeding disorders and their families. But before I ask you about how that's going to be expanded, do you know, either of you, whether that service is available to family members where the patient with a bleeding disorder may have died some time ago?
Yes, that would be available for family members.
Now, the service didn't include patients infected via blood transfusion or tissue or organ transplant or their families, but your statement, Ms. Gougeon, indicates that you've recently approved funding for this, and the aim is for it to be up and running, I think your statement says this, in the spring. Are you able to give us any update on that as to when the enhanced service will be available to those who were infected via transfusion?
Yes, 2 psychologists. I think we're actually starting this week. Again, I see Sam nodding her head, so that's correct. So they should be able to start taking appointments as of next month.
And is the funding for that, I think your statement tells us the projection for the next year of £78,000. Is that funding ring-fenced, and is there any form of long-term commitment to that funding, Ms. Gougeon?
It's not ring-fenced as far as I'm aware, but it's something that we just want to continue to monitor, because obviously we don't know what the uptake of the service is going to be and how that'll look. It could be, but if there's a high demand for it, we may need to look at extra resource. But I think that it's important that we continue that service. So as to future commitments, again, I don't know who, I may not be continuing on in this post, so it wouldn't be for me to commit for that for another minister, but I think it is really important that we provide that service, and I'm sure that whoever's in post will look to continue that. But I do think it's important we monitor it and see the resource that will be continue to be required.
And Ms. Baker, again, bearing in mind you've had the longer involvement than Ms. Gougeon, are you able to assist with why it's taken till now, and it would seem from Ms. Gougeon's statement the observations of the inquiry chair for this development, so that the service is extended beyond those with a bleeding disorder?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially when we set up SIBS, we had set up an arrangement so that people could apply for one-off grants for private counselling. I think initially we had felt that was probably sufficient, and that would be able to provide support for those who weren't able to use the haemophilia service. However, I think over time, well, initially there wasn't much take up. I think take up has increased recently, so we did have to make sure we promoted it more. But I think having reflected on it and reflected on comments that the chair made, I think about a year ago, around making sure that there was equivalent support for those who've had a transfusion, we felt we wanted to do a bit more work and see what level of demand there was, and so we looked at it through the SIBS survey of beneficiaries that took place last year. So we included some questions on that within the survey to try and gauge a bit more what sort of level of number of people might be interested. That certainly indicated that there would be some interest, not massive numbers of people, but that there definitely was some interest. So from that point, we wanted to take it forward and look at what we could do to set up a more bespoke service, because we recognise that people appreciate having a service that perhaps is more has more understanding about infected blood and the issues associated with it than a private counsellor might have.
Finally, can I ask you both to look at WITN 1146038? If we go to the next page, you'll see this is a response to a Freedom of Information request. And if we go to the third page, we can see a table giving the numbers of patients who are, or individuals who were members of the SIBS scheme who had died. Deceased since the 1st of July 2017, 53. Deceased since the 28th of February 2020, 11. this was as at the 3rd of August 2020, so no doubt there will have been others who have died since. Ms Gougeon, would you accept, in light of the numbers of people infected as a result of their treatment who have died and continued to die, that it's imperative that if changes are to be made to the scheme, whether by way of increased parity or other changes or a compensation framework, that those changes should be made as soon as possible?
Yes.
And if we could then just go back to the Paymaster General's letter to the Chancellor, EIBS 40705. We go to the bottom of this page, where the Paymaster General says under the heading Compensation for Victims, it is inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. Ms Gougeon, as Minister in the Scottish Government, do you share the view expressed by the Paymaster General that it is inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation to those infected and affected?
Yes.
And is the Scottish Government committed from its perspective to doing everything it possibly can to ensure that this is achieved?
Again, I know that there'll be the review into that. That's also been laid out by the Paymaster General in another letter. So I think that we would have to look at the recommendations of that and the recommendations of the inquiry as well as working with the other 4 nations in relation to that too. So all those discussions would have to take place. And again, I can't commit that for another minister who would come into post, but we would have to take that into serious consideration.
So those are the questions I have, but we obviously need to afford core participants the opportunity to suggest any further lines of questions arising out of the evidence this morning.
Yes, and you need some time
Yes.
to do that, but I'm conscious that both of you have busy jobs to attend to, so would it be sensible to take the short break now and come back, let us say, at 1:05, and finish what such questions as there are?
I'm certainly happy to do that. So I would ask perhaps 1:10, just because...
Yes, the alternative, I put it to you, actually, give you a choice, Ms Gougeon, Ms Baker. Would you prefer to have your break now until, say, 1:45, and come back then and finish off, or would you prefer to come back in at 1:10 and finish off then?
1:10 for me, it's just that there's votes in the chamber this afternoon appointing the First Minister, so ideally if I could be back for that.
Well, I can see that I can see you might want to be there for that, yes. Yes, very well.
1:10.
1:10. Yes, 1:10.